minute to... So I'd like to start this week with a correction. Last week I was asked about Reagan's anti-communist actions during the McCarthy era, when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And you might remember I said I didn't think that he dobbed in actors that he thought were communists. Well, I was wrong. He did. Classified documents obtained by the New York Times in 2012 reveal that Ronald Reagan was an FBI informant and provided the Bureau with dozens of actors' files. In return, the powerful FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, gave Reagan personal and political help. It's another example of Reagan getting help from someone more powerful than him. And this, you might remember, is that we talked about last week, is a theme of his career and continued throughout his career. In 1947, Reagan appeared as a friendly witness for a McCarthy committee hearing when he blamed unrest and strikes in Hollywood on what he called subversive elements, which was code for communists. So we can see Reagan contributed to the hysteria of the McCarthy era. So I'd like to thank the questioner. I don't recall who you were, but that's enabled me to correct an omission. So also last week we talked about Reagan's childhood, didn't we? And his early career in radio as a sports broadcaster. And we also talked about his career in Hollywood and his two marriages. We learned about the influences that shaped the 40th president, who was a major influence on creating the worst president in US history and the Republic's greatest threat to democracy and world peace. This week, we'll talk about the start of Reagan's political career. We'll talk about what set him on the path to the presidency and the foundations of his ideology that contributed to the rise of Trump. We'll look at Reagan's role at General Electric and how it contributed to his start in politics. And then we'll analyse a speech that many historians say gave Reagan his start on the national political stage. And then we'll talk about his campaign for Governor of California and his 2 terms. Now remember last week we said the presenter of General Electric Theatre, of General Electric Theatre, did 3 things for Ronald Reagan. First, it rescued him financially. It resuscitated his career and it laid the foundations for his political career. Reagan introduced the General Electric Theatre program, a film, a play or other entertainment, at 9 p.m. on Sunday nights. As well as his presenter role, he travelled throughout the United States to visit GE plants, and this was part of his job. He met workers and gave speeches on whatever he liked, as long as he promoted the virtues of free enterprise and electricity. He was paid, in today's Australian dollars, $1.4 million a year. The salary wasn't the only benefit though. The Reagan's Pacific Palisades home, a very modernist looking structure, I'm sure you'd agree, was equipped with all the latest General Electric products, all free of charge. The house had a retractable roof over an atrium, a heated swimming pool with underwater lights, intercoms in every room. It had 3 television sets, 3 refrigerators and a dishwasher, as well as a built-in garbage disposal. Now, these things we take for granted these days, even people that don't live in modernist homes. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, this was 1954 and the house was a showcase of all that was the latest and greatest. And for the Reagans, it was all free, which was a big appeal. But everything comes at a price. There was a condition. The Reagans had to open their home to the making of television commercials and other promotions like this one.
Oh, it's not.
Oh, but delicious. Everything's just right, isn't it, Patty? Delicious. Everything's just right, isn't it?
Well, it's the easiest meal to make. My electric servants do everything.
Well, that's part of living better electrically.
The English muffins. My new toaster toasted them. Then I sprinkled on some grated cheese and put them in the toaster oven down here, and that melted the cheese. The egg souffle.
It's something we haven't had in quite a while.
Oh, it's pretty tricky to make. But now, with the steady heat and the exact timing of my new automatic skillet, even a souffle is easy and safe to make.
So, Nancy Reagan, who wasn't generous and freeloaded where she could, developed a talent for getting things for nothing, which we will see in coming weeks got her into trouble. In March 1962, Ronald Reagan's General Electric gravy train came to a sudden and final stop. CBS gave him 24 hours notice it would cancel the show. He says the reason was because he refused to drop the political content of his speeches, that General Electric were concerned they were becoming too right-wing. But according to Nancy in her first memoir, General Electric Theatre ended after rival television network NBC moved Bonanza, a big budget 1 hour show in colour, to the same time slot as General Electric Theatre. But as always, and so that affected General Electric Theatre's ratings, but as always, there's more to the story, and at this time, General Electric had been charged with price fixing, which tarnished its reputation. So therefore, the company was more sensitive than usual to reputational damage. Well, Reagan's reputation was damaged by a Department of Justice inquiry about a conflict of interest when he was Screen Actors Guild president. And this came out at about the same time GE were thinking of cancelling the show. The scandal was about MCA, Hollywood's biggest talent agency. But it was the only agency in Hollywood that was given an exemption in 1952 that enabled it to be involved in the production of television shows. Now that meant MCA could act as an employer of actors while at the same time representing them. So you can see there's a clear conflict of interest. And the Screen Actors Guild, of which Reagan was president, okayed the arrangement. And there were allegations about MCA being involved in criminal activity. So at the inquiry, the Department of Justice inquiry, I don't recall was Reagan's answer to most of the inquiry's questions. So, the reasons for General Electric's decision to cancel Reagan's show were more than being upset about his speeches being too political. The loss of the GE job was an unexpected blow to Reagan, and he appealed to a GE executive to reconsider. When he refused, Reagan went to see Warner Brothers management about reviving his acting career, but he didn't get any encouragement. He was 51 years old, and he was forced to think about what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. He found it hard to see himself professionally as anything other than an actor. He and Nancy were moving and networking in Republican Party circles. One contact they made was William F. Buckley, who founded the conservative magazine The National Review in 1955. Buckley was considered the US's leading conservative intellectual of the time. Reagan wrote to him, which began a long association, and Buckley was a big influence on Reagan's political thinking. Also at this time, Reagan was giving speeches at Republican functions and at other events for other right-wing organisations. In 1962, he worked on Richard Nixon's unsuccessful campaign for Governor of California. According to one of Reagan's stories about how he became a Republican, and there's quite a few stories about how that happened, a woman in the audience of a fundraiser at which Reagan was speaking stood up in the middle of his speech and asked, "Mr. Reagan, are you still a Democrat?" And he said he was. She said she was a Republican Party official and wanted to change that, and marched up to the stage with a party registration form in hand. Reagan said he signed it and became a Republican. He then said to the audience, "Now, where was I?" There's a view Reagan's decision to change parties was heavily influenced by his father-in-law, a far right-wing Republican, Loyal Davis. Nancy disagreed, of course. He didn't influence Ronnie's views. Ronnie made up his own mind about things, and once he did, it was very hard for anyone to change it. Loyal Davis's son, Richard, agreed. He told author Bob Colacello, "This business of Dr. Loyal convincing Ronald Reagan that he should be a Republican, and a conservative Republican at that, is absolute nonsense." Whenever I saw Edith, that was Nancy's mother, and Loyal with Ronnie and Nancy, the dinner table conversation was about family affairs, the children, that sort of thing. They didn't really talk politics. But an account from another friend says that perhaps wasn't the case. The friend recalls a dinner at which the only topic of conversation was politics, and the Davises were urging Reagan to run for office. The contest for the 1964 Republican Party candidate for president was essentially a battle between the left and the right of the Republican Party. The Governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, on the left, and Senator Barry Goldwater on the right. Goldwater announced on the 3rd of January 1964 he would seek the Republican nomination for the presidency. "I will not change my beliefs to win votes," he said. "I will offer a choice, not an echo." Now, those beliefs unsettled some because the last two sentences of his acceptance speech at the Republican Party convention are telling. "Open extremism in the defence of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." So we can see where he's coming from. Reagan became an almost full-time volunteer for Goldwater. He was one of the campaign's most effective speakers and attracted large crowds. In mid-1964, he was guest speaker at a fundraiser dinner at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. A little aside, most of you, I'm sure, would have heard of this. This was the hotel in which Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June 1968. Now, back to the fundraiser Reagan was speaking at. In today's Australian dollars, each guest paid $15,400 to listen to Ronald Reagan. Now, fundraising dinners that people pay a lot of money to hear a speaker, particularly political speakers, are common now in the United States and in Australia and elsewhere. But this speech of Reagan's in 1964 was one of the first. It was a brilliantly crafted compilation of the topics that he'd been talking about for years. It was so well received, influential Republican and Reagan backers wanted it on national television. Oil exploration company founder Henry Salvatore and one of the United States' most successful car dealers, California-based Holmes Tuttle, paid for the speech to be televised on NBC. It was recorded in front of an invited audience and broadcast at 8:30 p.m. on the 27th of October 1964. That was 1 week before the presidential election. So let's have a listen.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to. And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Right, now there's a lot there that we'll come back to. The speech didn't help Goldwater, who lost.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves.
Who lost to President Johnson. But it did a hell of a lot for Ronald Reagan. The speech title was A Time for Choosing. Reagan called it the speech, an acknowledgement later in his life of its importance in starting his political career. It brought his politics to the attention of not just the American people, but also Republican Party power brokers who saw a potential winner. Already, some people were talking about a Reagan presidency. So let's have a closer look at the speech. We have Reagan, the storyteller, where he says, not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee. The Cuban refugee was fleeing the United States from communism. Now, Reagan warns that freedom was endangered by government. And if freedom is gone, Americans, unlike the lucky Cuban, had nowhere to go. And there was the elite bashing that I mentioned in week one. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. Now that's classic conservative politics. The right had long preached the virtues of small government and low taxes, but no one had expressed the argument as well as Ronald Reagan did in that speech. The imputation is these ruling elites in faraway Washington don't understand us, they don't act in our interests, indeed they act against us. They were acting against Reagan and his audience. We're all in this together. And this is something that Trump has used from the outset of his political career as well. Divide and rule is the modus operandi of extreme right-wing politics and today's Republican Party. The speech was 4,800 words, and in it, the phrase "you and I" was used. Was used 43 times, and "you and I" was used. Was used 57 times. So that kept reinforcing this "you and I" in this together, and these people in this despotic, faraway capital that's full of elites don't understand us and worse, are not acting in our interests. Nancy claimed in one of her memoirs, in the first weeks after the speech, that $122 million in today's Australian dollars was donated to the Republican Party. So not long after the speech, the money started rolling in. But her unauthorised biographer, Kitty Kelly, writes the amount was more like 15 million. But whatever it was, The important point here is people donated a huge amount of money because of Reagan's speech. Not only was Reagan a charismatic speaker, but he was also a good fundraiser, and that is a powerful political combination. Washington Post columnist David Broder declared Reagan had made the most successful national debut since William Jennings Bryan electrified the 1896 Democratic Party convention with his Cross of Gold speech. Goldwater won only 6 of the 50 states in the 1964 election. Republican Party members and power brokers looked for hope. Someone to fire their enthusiasm for the next contest. Because as you can see, this looked bad. It looked terrible. LBJ seemed unassailable. But as we know, he was. Now, let's have a look at the men who thought Ronald Reagan would enthuse the Republican Party. They were powerful and wealthy friends of the Reagans, and they became known as the Kitchen Cabinet. There were 8 of them, all white men, of course, and their number varied over the years, but we'll have a look at 5 to give you a flavour of the type of man who supported Ronald Reagan. Pharmaceutical company CEO and board member of the American Broadcasting Corporation and United Airlines, Justin Dart. Oil exploration company founder Henry Salvatore, mentioned last week, was the most conservative and ideological of the group. Holmes Tuttle, also mentioned earlier, was well connected and an office bearer of various establishment organisations as the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce and was a member of the California Club, among others. He was a member of a number of elites, a number of these elites that are terrible, out-of-touch people who are working against our interests. Jack Rather had been in the oil business in Texas, and he came to California in 1946, where he continued his entrepreneurial activities and became a television producer. They all lobbied Reagan to run for governor of California. Salvatore's son Laurie said, "My father felt, unlike Goldwater, Ronald Reagan could get elected because he spoke better than anyone else in the world." Now, implicit in that observation is it's not what you say that matters, it's how you say it, which Reagan understood, and he practiced it with perfection. Despite the pressure to run, Reagan was non-committal, apparently. He and Nancy were money conscious and cautious. He had just signed a contract to host a television series which didn't pay as well or was as prestigious as the General Electric role, but it did provide income certainty. Reagan's eldest son, Michael, claims Nancy was the main reason his father decided to run for governor. Michael wrote in his autobiography, "Personally, I don't think Dad ever had really strong ambitions to be a politician, but Nancy prodded him." Another prodder was Loyal Davis, the Conservative Republican. Now, most biographers agree that Davis was an influence, but of course Davis played that down. When he's asked my opinion, I've given it to him, that's all. I've never had any cause or effect on his politics, but he would say that, wouldn't he? So there's evidence Reagan had political ambition long before the lead up to the California campaign. One of the hundreds of people Nancy Reagan's unauthorised biographer Kitty Kelly spoke to was one of Reagan's movie co-stars in 1952, Virginia Mayo. She said, "He told me his first step would be Sacramento, then Washington. Sacramento is the capital of California, where the governor resides." 10 years later, his eldest child, Maureen, wrote to him about her concern about the liberal direction the country was going. "If we're talking about what I could do," Reagan wrote back, "I could be president." So I think this idea that Reagan was pushed into politics by his ambitious, social climbing and rather difficult wife is erroneous. Remember, it isn't considered decorous, even in the United States at that time, to be seen to be openly politically ambitious. Kelly writes, Lloyd Davis promised $3 million in today's Australian dollars if Reagan ran for governor. This money and the backing of his wealthy friends would have helped the avaricious Reagans decide to run. In February 1965, Reagan made the decision, but didn't want to announce it. He told the Kitchen Cabinet he wanted to put the feelers out to ascertain support. They formed an exploratory committee that hired a political consultancy who cast Reagan as a citizen politician. As you know, the first step to becoming a party's candidate in the United States is to win a majority of delegates to the party convention by winning primary elections. Registered party members vote in these elections. Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy on the 4th of January 1966. In a show of what was to become, the occasion was a made-for-television event. After the announcement, there was a reception for 6,000 supporters. 46-year-old Nancy had an eye lift for the event. In his televised speech, Reagan said, who we would like to be governor is not important. Who you want to be governor is very important. When incumbent governor, Democrat Pat Brown, was told Reagan was running, he thought it was a joke. Far from it. The Reagan campaign proved Brown badly wrong. After announcing his candidacy, his campaign hired a company called Behaviour Science Corporation of Los Angeles. It was a newly formed organisation headed by psychology professors who advised and directed Reagan every step of the way. It was one of the first organisations of its type that are now common in political campaigns in the United States. One thing behaviour science didn't do, though, was put words into Reagan's mouth. We hear this a lot about Reagan, that he was led and directed and pushed and prodded. But my reading is that he was a lot more determined than we're led to believe. One of the team of behaviour science said the speeches were all his. We didn't touch that. His short one-liners all came from him. His ability to ad-lib on the spot was just fabulous. He could handle any situation. And we saw what happened, didn't we? Not last Thursday, but the Thursday before, when you're in a debate and you can't ad-lib and you don't think on your feet. Reagan overcame the odds, though. He wasn't the favourite to win the election, but he overcame the odds and beat Pat Brown. He won 58% of the vote, and Brown won 42%. So after the election, one of the problems that arose was the governor's residence. You wouldn't think so, would you? But Nancy thought the governor's residence was too old. Well, these are serious problems, come on. It was a fire trap. She was worried about the safety of her children, to whom she was so devoted. And it had dark and gloomy halls. How could you expect the First Lady of California to walk down dark and gloomy halls? But she told her favourite magazine, Women's Wear Daily, and that's true, there is such a magazine, yeah, that she could be happy anywhere if my husband and children are with me. The truth is, her husband and children weren't often with her, especially her children, but that's another story. Now, you might be thinking that now Reagan was governor, his backers would come with a list of what they wanted done. Now, if we can believe Reagan, though, that was not the case. In a 1979 interview, he said that Holmes Tuttle told him, speaking on behalf of the Kitchen Cabinet, that you don't owe us anything. All we wanted was good government. We believed you could do that. You have no commitment, no promise to keep to anyone at all. You just do what you believe should be done. Well, if you receive money, there's an obligation, isn't there? You owe. And it might not be spoken, and it might not be written, but it's there. I am sure Reagan kept in mind what his backers would want when he made decisions, especially those that might affect them. In office, Reagan continued to rely heavily on his kitchen cabinet for advice and support. They'd get together once a week, and although there were disagreements, they were all strong conservatives. A task force on government efficiency and economy was established, which brought in 100 corporate executives to government agencies for 6 months to find ways to cut spending. In April 1967, 3 months after Reagan was sworn in, the Los Angeles Times published an article about the kitchen cabinet. It was the first documented use of the term in reference to Reagan's tycoon supporters. One of them assured the newspaper that there was only one boss, and that was Reagan. No one controlled him, but the idea he was being controlled lingered, as I said, throughout his term as governor and his presidency. In a scenario that will be familiar to you, in Reagan's first weeks in office, he discovered, surprise, surprise, a $400 million deficit, in Australian dollars that is, that had been covered up by accounting tricks used by Governor Brown. Reagan ordered a 10% across-the-board spending cut for all government departments, including the state's much lauded higher education system. Now, he went further and proposed charging tuition fees at the state's universities and colleges for the first time. In March, Reagan, the preacher of the virtues of low taxes, proposed a tax hike that would reap, in Australian dollars, $14 billion. It was the biggest tax hike by a state governor in US history. And it was proposed by a politician who had promoted and promised tax cuts for years. Holmes Tuttle provided money for a series of 90-second television advertisements in which Reagan put his case. Our state has been looted. You didn't mishear that. I beg your pardon. Reagan also introduced the most liberal abortion laws in the country. Now, you didn't mishear that. Reagan enacted the most liberal abortion laws in the United States at the time. There was a loud outcry from conservatives, but abortion wasn't the vote-changing issue that it is today. And we'll have a look about how that came about in week 5. Now, a scandal in Reagan's first term threatened to derail his governorship. His executive secretary was an early 30s-something hotshot Los Angeles lawyer. His name was Phil Battaglia. He was 2 metres tall. He was egotistical, arrogant, balding, married, and he had 2 children. He was responsible for, among other things, Reagan's staff of 87. He made decisions in Reagan's name, often without consulting him. Reagan didn't seem to mind Battaglia's executive style. Indeed, Reagan's style of management was hands-off, certainly wasn't a micromanager. Professional footballer and public relations practitioner Jack Kemp was a volunteer for Reagan's election campaign. He worked as an intern in the governor's office during the football off-season. Battaglia took Kemp under his wing. Kemp became a kind of personal aide to Battaglia, and they often went on trips out of town together. Kemp was grateful for the opportunity to go on these trips to Washington and elsewhere, which contributed to his career development. But he didn't know Battaglia was trying to keep his presence secret. And he didn't know the close relationship he had with Battaglia was causing talk and suspicion in the governor's office. Syndicated gossip columnists linked Kemp to a homosexual ring in Reagan's office. According to the columnists, Reagan's security chief had a tape recording of a sex orgy held at a Lake Tahoe cabin. They wrote that one of the 8 men involved was an athletic advisor on youth activities who has since gone on leave for the fall athletic season. Now, this is 1967 and homosexuality is illegal in the United States. Gay people feared blackmail, and for Reagan, allegations about gay staff becoming public could end his political career. And that worried his director of communications, Franklin Nofziger, who wrote in his memoir, because Reagan came out of the Hollywood scene, interesting terminology there, isn't there, where homosexuality was almost the norm, I also feared that rumours would insinuate that he too was one. In those days, that would have killed him politically. Nofziger talked to Reagan's head of security, Art Van Court, who started an investigation. At the same time, Reagan's cabinet secretary was also investigating. These 2 inquiries found no evidence to support the gossip columnists' claims. But Nofziger wrote they were still not convinced. We knew in our minds, though no place else for sure, that there was hanky-panky. We just couldn't prove it. They wrote about what they knew, suspected and heard, and gave the report to Reagan. At the meeting to discuss the report, and at which Nancy was present, and by the way, she was present at all important meetings, it was decided that Battaglia, the overconfident, far-reaching executive secretary, had to go. Kemp had already left to fulfil his football obligations and wouldn't return, so that was a bonus. Reagan, who hated confrontation, wasn't the one who had the difficult conversation with Battaglia. Now, this is extraordinary. That role was delegated by Reagan to someone who was not on Reagan's staff, who was not even an employee of the state of California. That role fell to Holmes Tuttle, who you'll recall was a kitchen cabinet member. Holmes Tuttle fired Battaglia. But the gay rumours dogged Kemp for decades. He denied them. There is absolutely not a shred of evidence. There is nothing, and there was nothing. In June 1987, Reagan's head of security, who did one of the investigations, said, "If something like that happened, I would have known about it." Now, at the time, Reagan, and remember the threat to homosexuality, the threat that would have been to his position, said homosexuality was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. Nancy denounced it as a sickness and an abnormality. But as was often the case with the Reagans, what they preached publicly wasn't what they practiced privately. They socialised with gay people. Their astrologer, Carol Reiter, was gay. Nancy maintained close relationships with gay author Truman Capote and depended on her gay hairdresser and interior decorator to define her style and taste. The hairdresser and his partner were often overnight guests at the White House. We don't know what they thought about we don't know what the hairdresser and his partner thought about being an abomination, sick or abnormal. There's another observation to be made here. Battaglia is part of a pattern in Reagan's staff. Reagan attracted highly intelligent, competent and driven people. They had strong personalities and at times alienated their colleagues and overstepped their authority. John Sears was another. He managed Reagan's campaign in 1979 for the presidency in the lead up to the primaries. We'll come back to him. Now to a group of people who supported Reagan. This Powford coterie was formed after the gay scandal. And these people stayed with him throughout his governorship and his presidency. And I might say that I think staff turnover is an indication of the person who's in charge. So if you've got a high churn rate, that tells you something. These men stayed with Reagan, as I said, throughout his governorship and presidency. William P. Clark and his deputy, Mike Deaver, and another third person was Edmund Meese III. This trio, as I said, served Reagan for a long time. Reagan engendered loyalty from his staff. One said when he was governor, he was the sweetest, kindest, most wonderful man to work for. One of the great things about him was that he never equated disagreement with disloyalty. You could disagree with him and he would listen, and then he would argue back and say, this is what I am thinking. And when you parted, you knew he'd never say, sounds like disloyalty to me. During his first year as governor, Reagan spent a fair bit of time away from the office, travelling the country, giving speeches at Republican Party events. At the South Carolina convention, delegates broke into a chant, Reagan 68, Reagan 68. And Reagan's response was an "oh shucks look, you don't mean me, do you?" Blushing, and then a broad grin to show how pleased he was. By the end of 1967, Reagan had raised, in Australian dollars, 21.6 million. In May 1967, Reagan debated Robert Kennedy in a television debate about the Vietnam War. The audience, I tried to find it and I couldn't find it anywhere. It would have been great to see. The late historian David Halberstam acknowledged that the general consensus was that Reagan destroyed Kennedy. One journalist declared it was possible Reagan, after less than a year in public office, this was after he saw the debate, that Reagan would be the next Republican candidate for president. He wasn't, as we know, but these wins were another brick in the foundation of Reagan's claim on being the Republican Party's presidential candidate at some time. Richard Nixon, as we know, won the Republican nomination in 1968 and the presidency. But he thought Reagan might challenge him for the nomination in 1972. Now that says a lot about Richard Nixon. It says a lot about his paranoia. Because in 1971-72, he was polling well, and that's the first point, he was polling well, so who's going to challenge a sitting president's polling well? And no Republican president, sitting president, had ever been challenged before. So it'd be highly unlikely. But Nixon was convinced, and in September 1969, he asked Reagan to represent him at the opening of a cultural centre in the Philippines. Now this was to sort of throw a sweetener to him to keep him happy. He knew that he liked travel, especially Nancy, liked going to other countries. But it was a mostly ceremonial trip, as I said. Nixon thought Nancy was smart and tough, that she was her husband's chief advisor, and Nixon said, Nancy Reagan runs Ronald Reagan. You just can't afford to alienate her. Reagan was re-elected governor of California in 1970. His winning margin over the Democrat was half his margin in 1968, so he lost a fair bit of support. Author Bob Colacello says the great achievement of Reagan's second term was the Welfare Reform Act of 1971. It took 6 months of struggle with the Democratic Party Speaker of the House of Representatives to get the bill through the legislature. Reagan's staff didn't think the bill had any chance of getting through. But Reagan had been determined to control what he called the welfare monster. And he persisted. He wouldn't give up. Aid to families with dependent children in California was increasing by $40,000 a month. In March 1971, Reagan announced a proposal that would cut welfare spending by $800 million a year by tightening eligibility requirements and closing loopholes. Funds for the truly needy would be increased. The most controversial part of the bill would force able-bodied fathers and mothers with older children to work at public service for their payment. Reagan signed the bill into law on the 13th of August. In his second term, Reagan cut welfare benefits to 300,000 people, cut various taxes by 5 million, and the state budget increased 89% during his time in office. Reagan expanded state parks. You wouldn't think that, would you? He sponsored the nation's toughest water pollution control laws. He established the Air Resources Board to reduce smog-reducing vehicle emissions. Now, let's have a quick recap about what I've talked about this week, and then if you've got any questions, we'll have time for that. So we talked about the start of Reagan's political career and his role at General Electric. We talked about the speech that he referred to as the speech that gave him his start on the national political stage. And we talked about his 2 terms as Governor of California. Now, does anyone have... Oh, and wait on. Before we get there, we should talk about next week. Some of you might like to come back, even delay travel plans to come back, who knows. We'll continue our journey next week, and we'll take a little detour to the 1960s and 70s to understand the factors that led to the rise of Reagan. And we'll also talk about the economic downturn of the 1970s, particularly what happened to the oil price and its disastrous effects. And we'll talk about the religious rights upturn. Now, does anyone have any questions, queries, comments, or criticisms? Yes, sir.
So Reagan managed California as a big spending Democrat.
Yeah.
Where did he get his money from?
So the question was that Reagan managed California like a Democrat. Well, he did, except for the cuts to welfare and cuts to university tuition fees and other education cuts. But if you put those aside, yes, there's an argument for that. I'm not sure what the deficit was that he ran, but it was there. And I think that, the abortion laws and things like that are amazing. You wouldn't think it. Anybody else? Yes, Kathy?
Well, just following that, which was my question as well, how do you explain at that point in his life the sort of somewhat more democratic, I know not the welfare cuts, and
Yeah.
not, necessarily, cutting taxes, but what he did for parks and wildlife and pollution and abortion laws, which were all
So-
liberal.
Yeah, so the question was, how can we explain these, what you could call Democratic Party decisions that Reagan made, especially on environment and abortion law? Well, I think this probably is an example of what he wanted to do. And I think, look, I'm certainly not a Reagan apologist. I'm just trying to be objective. But I think that he really wanted to do that. And I'm not sure that the kitchen cabinet would have agreed with all that. They would have loved all the spending cuts, the cuts to welfare programs and all that sort of thing. But I think that there's a case that Reagan ran a big government in California. Yeah. And the gentleman in front of you had a question.
Since Reagan and Schwarzenegger both Republican, California is virtually totally democratic these days. Has something changed between then and now?
So the question is that California was fairly democratic in those days. I would say that it was, and I'd say it still is. The Democrat presidential candidate always wins California and New York. California's always been a progressive sort of state, and I think that might help explain also Reagan's support for some of those initiatives that he implemented, because that would keep the electorate happy. I think we could describe him as certainly a centrist Republican, if not a liberal Republican, but that changed. That changed over time. Yes.
Everybody has a speech writer. Now, did the speech which put Reagan on the stage, did he was good at one-liners and he was good at charisma, but did somebody else behind him write that speech?
So the question was the question was, did Reagan write that or someone else? Because these people in public life often have speechwriters. That's quite true. I think it's likely that someone probably drafted it for him, but every major speech that he made, even when he was president, he made changes and put a lot of himself into it. He loved words. And I think, despite his reputation as being a bit of a dullard, I'm not convinced that he was. Remember last week we talked about how his mother read to him and his brother, that he grew up with a love of books and words. So I don't think it was a case of, here you are, Ronnie, read this. I think it was, here's a draft, what do you think? And he would have gone through it and put a lot of himself in it. I think he could perhaps liken his approach because of his long movie career. He knew that other people made him look good as an actor. So an actor is dependent on the director, the producer, and the people around him or her to look good. And I think that he had a great talent for getting good people around him. People who had talents and abilities that he didn't. And he was smart enough to recognise that. But that's off point. To answer your question is yes, I think that he would have had a lot of input into that speech. Anybody else before we part company? Yes, Ian?
This may well be slightly off topic. Do you think that America's total misunderstanding of what socialism is comes from that era?
So the question was, do I think that the United States' misunderstanding of socialism comes from that era? Look, I'm not sure that it comes from that era, but I think that deeply embedded in the United States DNA is this attachment, this obsession with freedom, being able to do what I want to do without interference. And I think when communism came along, they could point to something and say, well, that is not what we want. We're not going to be told how to dress, how to live and all that sort of thing. So I think that's long been there. I think socialism has been grossly misunderstood. I think the word's been weaponised like elites. And you might remember during the debate about President Obama's healthcare scheme that there were members of the Congress saying this legislation is Stalinist Russia stuff, right? So I think there's a real lack of understanding about what socialism is, what communism is, and what do we mean by freedom. Lots of people. So I'll start with you, Jane, and we'll come back to Dr. Bowler.
Oh, Brad, because I just wanted to go make a comment really based on what we were just talking about communism and socialism. I think ironically, the reason Americans don't like to tell what to do because it's the American dream. You work hard enough, then you'll succeed, and the inference being if you're not succeeding, you're not working hard enough. And so I think that's largely part. It's a bit like if someone's told me, I can't buy a lotto ticket. I'm never going to win a lotto, but I don't want to be told I can't. So it's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's my my thoughts on what you're saying about communism. But the irony is that this attitude to not having welfare, I mean, that'd be a great one to think about welfare budgets. But what you do then is you create a cohort of people who are just ripe to swallow all the guff of these populists who tell you that you're in this mess, not because we cut welfare and don't have any education, but because elites or whatever are wrong. So it's actually blown up in their face. This is my view.
Yeah, so the comment was that the United States has this ethos of the American dream that if you work hard, you can achieve what you want. Now, if you don't achieve what you want, that's your problem. You didn't work hard enough, and that's a classic right-wing, extreme right-wing position. And the commenter was saying that now there's a whole class of people that haven't achieved the American dream, and that's, the inference was that that's where Trump's support's coming from. That really, in a nutshell, is the basis of my argument. The people have been left behind. And when you've been left behind and you can't see a way of catching up, and someone comes along and says, I'll give you a helping hand, not only that, I understand you. I'm not one of these elite bastards in Washington. I'm here, I'm on your side, and only I can help you. That's that is where Trump's support comes from. Reagan created it, and we'll see in coming weeks about some of the terrible decisions that he made that created that divide. So it's not about having a fair go, because it's impossible for some people to have a fair go, and it's also impossible for some people, I'd say, to fail, because they're so wealthy that they've got, the extremities are so great that the chances of you not succeeding are zero. Dr. Bowler, you had a question? Wendy, sorry.
When you talked a lot about the people around Reagan and the support for him, and the slide of the three men who were very supportive and continued with him while he was being president. I'm just wondering if I think he made me think about Biden and the advisors and people around him. And whether this is a sort of a problem now, arguably, that if you were so loyal and you've been with someone for such, through thick and thin, whether then you're unable to properly advise, for instance, with Biden now, as to whether he should, think about standing aside. So I'm just wondering about the parallel there, whether the advisors around Biden. So I guess I'm throwing it forward.
Right. So the question was: is there a link between the advisor's loyalty and giving fair and frank advice? Well, first, I think there possibly is. I think in Reagan's case, from what I've read, he questioned advice all the time. Do you think this is a good idea? Should we do this? Why is it a good idea? He certainly, the impression I got was the people around him weren't necessarily yes people, right? I don't know enough about Biden's advisors to say whether, they're yes people or not, or whether they've got the courage to say, boss, your time's up, you need to do the right thing by the nation and not run. I'm not sure of the answer. Well, an echo chamber, possibly, yes, but at the same time, I think that there's a lot more to that we haven't probably got time to go into now, but an interesting parallel there. Now, Sal, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, it's all right, you'll run out of time, it's okay.
Oh, right. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming on. I'd like to thank the visitors especially for coming. And I hope to see you all, most of you, next week. Thank you.